But if we don't let cool heads prevail on the situation in Ukraine, this is the first time, really, in my adult life, because I was alive when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, where I think that there could be some means or some measures taken where we have a nuclear standoff. And I don't say that lightly at all for a guy.
Question I have to ask you, putting on your hat as a military expert, I keep seeing in the media this war propaganda that tells me that the Ukrainians are somehow prevailing in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Now, you and I are going to be branded as pro-Russian, which is nonsensical, simply because we don't want to send billions more to the Ukrainian government because it's corrupt. But what is your assessment of what's going on now on the ground in this conflict?
Yeah, so first of all, this has been going on since the tail end of the Obama administration. I mean, really, halfway through the second term, February 2014 is what I like to remind people. That is when the Russians, because they saw a feckless leader in the White House, they went ahead and attacked into the two eastern Donbasses of Ukraine, and then of course Crimea. And then of course when Trump came in, Trump basically, they weren't certain what to think of Trump, so they did nothing, and it went to a stalemate then. And of course when Biden comes back in, they re-energize their offensive operations and to basically hold and then control the ground that they currently are on right now. So strategically, the way I would describe this is that this is at a strategic stalemate, and that you have a losing proposition for Ukraine. Clearly, this war is over for Ukraine. Ukraine does not have the capabilities. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the weapon systems. At best, they might have some small arms that are being fed in there by either European nations, some NATO nations, probably the United States. But anything that's large scale weaponry gets destroyed almost immediately, because and the other thing is any sophisticated weaponry that's given to a nation like Ukraine, you got to take the time to train on it. You can't just, you can't train on a surface to air missile in a couple of days. It takes weeks, in some cases months. So any of that sophisticated weaponry that did make its way, most of that has been destroyed, if not all of it. So it's a strategic stalemate, because what is happening on really on both sides, to include Zelensky. I think Zelensky, if you cornered him and you asked him, would you want to sue for peace in some way, he'd probably say yeah, because at a certain point in time, he will probably meet his demise. I mean, either internally or externally. What we cannot allow, and this goes back to NATO, because there's been an awful lot of talk on the NATO side about having Ukraine join NATO, to even include the NATO Secretary General has mentioned it. We've had military leaders, general officers in NATO that have talked about the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, we've had our own White House talk about this. We cannot get to that level. We cannot have those kinds of conversations. And so strategically, it's a stalemate. Tactically, the Russians have, they're sort of on their front foot, where the Ukrainians, they're not on their back, their heels right now. The Ukrainians are actually on their knees, because they've lost so many of their military age men during this war that's now been going on since the Biden administration came in, for the better part of 3 years, and will continue, particularly in these tactical skirmishes. So and before I go into what I think needs to happen, I want to remind the audience that NATO is a defensive military alliance. Okay, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a defensive alliance. It is an alliance that was designed principally after World War II in order to defend any nation that was part of it from an attack from an external foe, meaning in this case at that time really the Warsaw Pact, led by Russia. So it's a defensive alliance. Yet NATO has been acting very offensively over the last 25 years. I found it fascinating, because I know this because I studied some of this, and during the 90s. When Putin talked to Tucker Carlson in his great interview, I thought Putin said that if Russia had been asked to join NATO in the mid 90s, then maybe they could have joined NATO. I do know for certain, because I was part of what's called the Partners for Peace exercise and Partners for Peace operations in the mid 90s, where we were doing joint training with Russians at the time, where we had U.S. military forces going over to Russia. We had Russians coming over to the United States, training with us to try to develop a camaraderie, military to military. I mean, we have been conducting operations in the Middle East with Russians in Syria, principally. Prior to this was during the tail end of really the Obama administration, and then into the Trump administration, where we're trying to cooperate with them against these radical Islamists. But yet now we have NATO acting, I believe, at least politically offensively, by saying we want to bring Ukraine into the NATO charter. That would be like China saying we're going to bring Cuba and make Cuba as a part of the CCP. We're going to make Mexico part of the CCP umbrella, and we're going to have Canada join. Now in the case of Canada, because of Trudeau being I think a hardcore communist, he might actually raise his hand for that. But to stay on Ukraine, we are in a place where there has to be strong leaders who sit down, and maybe the Paris Peace Accords, although they're having to deal with the situation in the Middle East right now, which is really, it's a disaster waiting to happen if it hasn't already happened. But if we don't let cool heads prevail on the situation in Ukraine, this is the first time really in my adult life, because I was alive when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. I was a young kid at the time, but this is the first time in my life, my adult life, where I think that there could be some means or some measures taken where we have a nuclear standoff. And I don't say that lightly at all, for a guy that knows what our nuclear system is capable of doing. And frankly, I know what Russia's nuclear system is capable of doing as well. So we have to, everybody's got to take a deep breath. Everybody's got to sit down at a table, and we've got to decide what is it that we want to achieve here. And we've got to allow the people in that part of the world, that means the Russians and the Ukrainians, to sit there and talk. Maybe there's some adults in the room, so to speak, like the left likes to say, now that they have adults in the room. Well, when their adults show up, we end up at violent, vicious, savage wars, which is what we're involved in right now. And there's also talk about nuclear weapons like I've never heard talked about in my adult, my career in the military, and certainly the last 5 or 6 years. So anyway, strategically, we're at a stalemate. It needs to stay that way. Politically, we need to get to a peace agreement and a peace accord and deal with this issue now, because otherwise, this and what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Panama, and what's happening over in potentially in the Pacific, vis-a-vis Taiwan and China, we're going to find ourselves in a much greater level of World War III than we are already in. Because I do agree with the person in Yuval Noah Harari. If I agree with him on anything, which he said the other day, we are already experiencing World War III. I agree with him on that. That's probably the only thing I agree with him on.
A man who's gone through hell, but he's kept going, and he's smart, and he's strong, and people love him. Not everybody, but people love him and respect him. Roger Stone. Where's Roger Stone?